distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, friends, it's my pleasant duty and also my burden to be the moderator of this session, but since we are all very moderate, I don't think my job will be difficult. And I would like to say that this broad topic is East and West. And when you say East and West, immediately the name of Rudyard Kipling comes to mind. And you know, the famous axiom about the fact that both are so different that they may never meet. And yet we have had other interpretations of that encounter or dialogue, including the Clash of Civilizations, of course, and then Francis Fukuyama's concept of essentially the West imposing its model to the entire world, and every other culture becoming in some way absorbed by it. So I think we will try to present varied perspectives on this subject. And our panelists have not expressed any particular preferences to the order in which they would like to speak. But I think perhaps I would take then the privilege of the moderator and ask Dr. Arvind Sharma to begin.
Mr. Chairman. And what I'd like to do, in order to make the best use of the time I have, is to point out that the concept of religion in this interaction between the East and the West has largely gone unexamined. And that this has had very serious consequences, especially in terms of human rights discourse. When we talk of religions and mention the various religions of the world, and the three religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the religions of Indian origin, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, the religions of Chinese origin, Confucianism and Taoism, we can also add Shinto and so on. The impression is somehow created that the word religion is a neutral term which can be applied to all of these without any problem. Now I want to problematize this because there is a basic distinction between these religions, between missionary religions and non-missionary religions. The missionary religions are primarily Christianity and Islam. And the non-missionary religions, Judaism as we know it now, Hinduism, in a certain sense Buddhism, and then Jainism, Sikhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto. They are non-missionary. That is to say, their religion does not impose on them the duty of spreading them. We have to make a subtle distinction here between proselytizing and accepting people. In proselytizing, you seek a convert to your religion. And this is what essentially missionary means. But if you want to use the word missionary in a more general sense, then the right word would be proselytization. You seek converts. Religions like Hinduism and others, Sikhism, they accept converts. If people want to join them, yes. But they don't seek them out, and nor are they obliged by the doctrines, their own beliefs and practices to do so. Now what this does is, the consequences of this become very clear when we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to freedom of conscience, belief, religion, and the right to, this right includes the right to change one's religion. And then it goes on to say, and the freedom to exhibit your religion and manifest your religion in whatever way you like. Now, what does this do? What this does is, or what it tells us is rather, that the provision, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, has been drafted with a Western concept of religion in mind. For that Western concept of religion, being a missionary religion is a natural feature of religion. Therefore, the emphasis on the right to change and then to exhibit, to propagate, and so on. Right? Now, what are the consequences of this? Let us suppose that a member of a missionary religion is facing a member of a non-missionary religion. Right? Now, I think all of us will agree that if a person belonging to the non-missionary religion does not wish to be made an object of proselytization, if a member of a non-missionary religion does not wish to be made the object of proselytization, then religious freedom as a concept should protect that person, should enable the person to protect his or her freedom of conscience. I hope this will be acceptable to all of us as a reasonable ethical position. Someone may want to convert me, but if I say, no, I don't wish to be made the object of your missionary activity or proselytization, that should be let alone. And that I should be able to invoke Article 18 in my protection. My freedom of religion is compromised. If somebody is doing a namaz and a Christian comes to him and says, stop doing this, you are sinning sort of and you should become a Christian, all of us will feel that this is not wrong, this is not right. This is not the right way of doing this. There is at least an ethics of proselytization. You may engage the person outside the mosque and then try to persuade him and so on. But all these issues get obscured. And to dramatize this, let me point out what the Lausanne Covenant says. The Lausanne Covenant is a covenant which was drawn up in 1974 by 4,000 Christian evangelical bodies. And I'll read out para 13 from the Lausanne Covenant. We therefore pray for the leaders of the nations and call upon them to guarantee freedom of thought and conscience and freedom to practice and propagate religion in accordance with the will of God and as set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. End of quote. I have not seen any document, or I have no instance, there's no instance I know of, in which this article has been used by a person who does not wish to be made the object of proselytization by saying that we are violating Article 18. See the imbalance here? And the consequence of the imbalance, this is where the East and West comes in. Because in the Western concepts of religion, exclusive religious identity is a feature of religion. Apart from being missionary, which is a kind of a Christian take on it, and a Christian and a Muslim take on it. And at one time, Judaism also was believed to be missionary around the beginning of the Christian century, but not anymore. If we look at the religious experience of India, China, and Japan, we find that multiple religious affiliation or participation or identity is even the norm during certain historical periods, and certainly not something odd. The evidence from India, I think we are all familiar with that. I'll skip that. But just to give you an example of what the census can do, by insisting that you only give one religion as the religion to which you belong. If you went over to Nepal, which was never covered by the British census, and you ask a Nepali whether he's a Buddhist, he will say yes. and whether he's a Hindu, he will say yes. There's massive documentation of this, especially by Axel Michaels, more recently. But if you come over to India, because the census insists that you give only one religion as the one to which you belong, and I have to ask you, should we allow our religious reality to be modified to suit the semantic conventions of a European language? I mean, this is bizarre to me. We go to China. I was warned in my study of comparative, when I began my study of comparative religion, not to think that because there are the three teachings, Sanjiao in China, Confucianism, Taoism, and Chinese Buddhism, that some Chinese are Confucians, some are Taoists, and some are Chinese Buddhists. The reality was that in the public life, the Chinese may be Confucian, and private life either Taoist or Buddhist, and so on. Or in a stage of one's life, one might incline to one tradition, and in another to another. The evidence from Japan is even more. Oh, by the way, I come back to China. China is once again ahead of us. In the PRC Constitution of 1982, People's Republic of China, there's a provision not directly dealing with religion, but with customs and habits. And this is what it says. Each nationality has the freedom to retain or change, which we would expect to be the language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The freedom to retain or change. Retain is missing in the Universal Declaration, but the Chinese Constitution has it. Each nationality has the freedom to retain or change its customs or habits. So as I said earlier, China has beaten us again on this. Right. Japan provides even more striking evidence. I think Sri Sri Ravi Shankar ji referred to Nixon's predicament when he was in Japan, and the Shinto priest told him that 80% of Japanese follow Shinto, and the Buddhist leader told him that 80% of the Japanese follow Buddhism. The 1985 census of Japan, when analyzed in terms of percentages, reads as follows. 95% of the Japanese declared themselves as followers of Shinto. And 76% of the same population also declared itself as followers of Buddhism. I would not be surprised if this would have been the Indian reality if the census did not insist that you can only give one religion as the one to which you belong. And might be the reality if the census is operations are modified in independent India to conform to our reality. When you change your religion, that is when you change your religion in terms of becoming a Muslim or a Christian, when an Indian does this, when you change your religion, you do not just change your religion, you also change your concept of religion. I think we need to really absorb this. That is, you can only belong to one religion. You do not just change your religion, you also change your concept of religion. The Hindu position, as we all know, is well known, but is very well expressed in this statement that if it is not necessary to change, because all religions are true or valid or whatever, if it is not necessary to change, it is necessary not to change in the Hindu view of the spiritual economy of the universe. And finally, if you belong in multiple religious affiliation, then for you there is no other. There is another, just another. So I'd like to conclude by saying that if we bring all this analysis to bear on the UN discourse on human rights, then the UN discourse on human rights has been trading on an ambiguity. The ambiguity lies with the word conversion. The right to conversion actually collapses or conflates two rights. My right to change my religion and somebody else's right to ask me to change my religion. And because missionary religions don't see much purchase in making this distinction, we have what we have, as we have discussed earlier. But I think we should take steps to clear up this ambiguity. A very dramatic way of doing that would be to set up our own Indian Commission on Religious Freedom, which, just as the American institution with a similar name, identifies all the problems which the Christian missionaries face when they try to exercise their quote-unquote freedom of religion. The Indian Commission should similarly point out the problems those people face who are made the objects of proselytization against their will. I think I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
My very dear and distinguished friends, both on the dais and in front, the theme given for this session is somewhat abstrusive, abstract, and if I may say so, too open-ended. Without citing Kipling or Northrop on the meeting of East and West, let me, friends, do a bit of loud thinking. What happens where East meets West? I believe the result is Swami Vivekananda, Shri Aurobindo, Rabindranath Tagore, Dr. Radhakrishnan, Muhammad Iqbal, Yogananda Paramhans, Gandhi, Nehru, and others. When East meets West, these figures are born. It is another matter that the last named, that is Jawaharlal Nehru, was not so much from the East. He was more of an English gentleman who had later to make a discovery of India. He was more of an English gentleman, and after spending 20 years in Britain, he came to India to look at India's past and present from a Western prism. As he himself said, he was a mixture of the East and the West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere, his own words, at home nowhere. On the other hand, I told you when the East meets West, on the other hand, when the West came to India, it conquered, colonized, and plundered. When the East landed in the West, it carried a message of universal brotherhood, compassion, harmony, spiritualism, respect for all religions, and things like yoga. For close to 1,000 years, India was subjected to barbaric invasions from the West. The West subjugated the East in different manners. One invader, as we all know, took great pride in having killed 100,000 heathens on a single day on our soil. Until the 18th century, India was one of the richest countries of the world, with 28% of the world's GDP, have been told, and 22% of the total world's trade. That was India's share. The much talked about Indian famines were actually all of them actually happened during the British rule, when 25 million Indians died. The British masters derided the precepts of Indian culture and traditions and imposed Western values and concepts. The impact was sinister and lasting. Since Constitution has been mentioned, as a student of the Constitution, I cannot but flag the point that even our Constitution that came from the Constituent Assembly was not made by we, the people of India. The leadership was largely foreign educated, Western oriented, and nurtured in British concepts and culture and fascinated by British institutions. Neither the ethos and genius of India nor the views of Aurobindo, Gandhi, JP, or others seemed to have influenced them. 75% of the entire Constitution of India was an adoption or adaptation of the Government of India Act 1935, read with the Cabinet Mission Plan 1946 and the Indian Independence Act 1947. All the three documents, mind you, were made by the British for us Indians, and the purpose was more to divide and rule even after they had gone. Friends, in psychological terms, it can be said that a slave looks to his master as the model and as the ideal. He is anxious to copy. It was natural that we looked up to the system and the institutions of our rulers as the best. No wonder we adopted not only English dress, education, and language, but also the whole of their administrative, legal, and political system. Even during the early days of the freedom struggle, one of the Congress demands used to be that the British should concede to their Indian subjects the same institutions and freedoms that they themselves enjoyed back home. The seeds of the colonial model of government in India can be traced back to this demand. Also, it is said that those fighting against their masters, that is, the slaves fighting against their masters, are not really fighting against the evil of slavery, but they are eager to themselves take the place of their masters and have slaves working under them. I am reminded of the Urdu poet Akbar Allahabadi, who said, मुझे नफरत नहीं थी अंग्रेज की सूरत से, नफरत थी तो उसके तर्ज हुकूमत से. I did not hate the British, did not dislike their face, but I disliked their mode of governance. And what actually happened was that the masters changed from white to brown, but the ordinary people in their fields and hamlets did not feel the glow of freedom on their faces or the transfer of power to their hands. अंग्रेज चले गए, लेकिन तर्ज हुकूमत वही चलता रहा. The colonial model continued. Even today, the source of many of our problems of lack of good, citizen-friendly, clean, development-oriented, corruption-free governance is in the continuation of this Western colonial model, which was designed to divide and rule. Friends, if I may submit, a time comes in history when urgent action becomes a categorical imperative. It seems at last that time has come now. We must seize the opportunity and bring about necessary systemic reforms in governance in order to enable us to repossess ourselves and the soul of our ancient nation. It is now or never. The opportunity may not recur, and if it is missed, the consequences may be disastrous for our democratic polity. Also, without necessary political reforms, it seems to me, and without discarding the colonial model, neither economic nor judicial, administrative, educational, or any other reforms are likely to succeed or survive. The latest Western offensive is in the much bandied about globalization. There is nothing wrong or new in the concept of world being one. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors spoke of the world being one family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But it is to be noted that there is a fundamental difference in the Western and Indian approaches. While we want the whole world to live like one family, where joys and sorrows are equally shared and all the family members help each other, in the Western concept of a global village, the attempt is to make it a marketplace or a big mandi where everything is bought and sold. While we need development, definitely. Economic growth is not everything. India cannot afford to sacrifice the noble values of our culture and high principles of our spiritual heritage at the altar of higher GDP or GNP growth. Quality of life and human worth cannot be measured purely in economic terms. The West is wrong in considering man as a machine, a commodity, or merely as a resource to be developed for maximization of production and profits. The Western concept of human beings as a resource has become fashionable and got embedded in our management and official discourses, as if men are merely cannon fodder, only a resource like iron ore or coal. When I say men, women is included, of course. In fact, human personality, both individual and collective, should be regarded as the ultimate end purpose for which all the resources have to be harnessed. That is the way to integral human development, which in different words has been spoken of by Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and Pandit Deendayal Upadhyaya. For thousands of years, the highest thinking in India has been of the superiority of moral and spiritual values to material wealth and worldly attainments. Sacrifice of self-interest to help and serve others has always commanded respect and love of the people. The highest ideals of life have included asteya, aparigraha, santosh, minimization of wants, and simple living. Sustainable consumption is more important than sustainable growth. Real happiness, according to us, comes from tyag or sacrifice. Tena tyaktena bhunjita. I would like to end with a quote from a French scholar who wrote in a recent work, India holds the key to the world's future. For India is the only nation which still preserves in the darkness of our Himalayan caves, on the luminous ghats of Banaras, in the hours of our countless yogis, or even the minds of our ordinary folk, the key to the planetary evolution, its future and its hope. The 21st century then will be the era of the East. This is where the sun is going to rise again after centuries of decadence and submission to the West. That is where the focus of the world is going to shift, unquote. Thank you. Bande Mataram.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished co-panelists, and distinguished friends. Before contemplating on where East and West meets, or whether they meet at all, in fact, Dr. Kashyap has raised certain fundamental questions. I would first ask how we define East and West. It's a tough exercise, as there are multiple Easts and multiple Wests. We have Southeast Asia, we have East Asia, we have Far East. Without denying these apparent differences in terms of civilizational histories, traditions, cultures, customs, philosophies, at a deeper level, I find this dichotomous and often combative understanding of East-West is a false conceptualization. When the present world is finding it hard to grapple with the battle between us and them, from Peshawar to Sydney, I congratulate the organizers of this conference, conceiving convergence, not divergence, yearning for meeting grounds, not battlegrounds. Well, I agree on a couple of issues, but still there is a different perception because I am trying to see the meeting points. I will just pick up one issue, one element that constitutes the fulcrum of the universe and makes all such constructions like East, West, North, South irrelevant, and that is humanism. Humanism is vague, I admit. it is abstract. The definition is difficult. When I was traveling from Amsterdam to Delhi, I watched a Hindi movie where the assistant of the gangster asked his boss, एक गोली में एक आदमी मर जाता है? Then the reply was, एक गोली में एक आदमी नहीं, दो आदमी मरते हैं. The killer as well as the killed. Killed obviously, but the killer also dies. Killer is also killed. This is a very nuanced understanding, very simple dialogue, but that appeals me. That is my understanding of humanism, that the killer is doing an inhuman act despite having humanism. I am not generalizing this definition. There are questions. The question can be asked whether the Peshawar killers were human. Any humanism left with them when they killed 200 kids, innocent children? These are larger questions, but I think this is a question where we must recognize what is humanism. Humanism is a puzzle. To decipher humanism is very difficult. There are numerous brands of humanism. Vedic humanism, we talked about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Renaissance humanism, the West glorifies Renaissance humanism. Scientific humanism, secular humanism, divine humanism, spiritual humanism, new humanism, and people also talk of Holocaust humanism, military humanism. Very contradictory. Can there be a military humanism? Because different kinds of interventions today is done in the name of protecting humanity. These are the few examples that humanism contains grains of anti-humanism. When we talk of humanism, also understand defining humanism, that I give example of Tibet. It presents a different kind of humanism. A generation of Tibetan being oppressed for long has not resorted to violence, still searching peaceful solution to that problem. This is incredible. This kind of humanism is very different from the kind of retaliatory framework of humanism and terror. Also, with regard to genealogy, without claiming Eastern superiority, as pointed out, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina certainly came much prior to Renaissance. Confucian humanism and Taoism existed much before Voltaire and Hume. While not trying to score any points, I would agree and concede that though the humanism actually existed in earlier times, Renaissance certainly contributed to its renewal and reawakening in modern times. So we cannot, when we talk of the meeting points, we can't really the contributions of Renaissance, despite our difference in understanding. There are various forms of humanism. People talk of epistemological humanism, psychological humanism, definitional humanism, agential humanism, value humanism. I don't have time to discuss all that, but I would say that all these forms, despite the lacuna, are committed to the ideas of creating a better world, more human, just, and hospitable. That is, I think, my understanding of humanism. What we should first reject is ism part of humanism. Any ism is oppressive, as I see. So we look for humanness, we look for a human world, universe, with this understanding that there are many worlds and there is a shared content, and that content is human content. To err is human, but repeated erring is unpardonable. Everybody does mistakes. Civilizations have made mistakes. Every civilization, every document of civilization, as Walter Benjamin says, is also a document of barbarism. It was pointed out eloquently by Dr. Kashyap. So the mistakes have been committed, and mistakes are still being committed. We are not learning from those mistakes. So the idea is to push not to commit those mistakes and every culture, every society has made mistakes. If Germany had made mistake, it was horrendous. But also we can see mistakes in Cambodia and Rwanda. We can't really ignore that. Second, I am critical of this arrogance of humanism, arrogance of enlightenment rationality. That, as Dr. Sharma has pointed out, that this very arrogance treated us barbarians. To defend their act of barbarism, they created the other, that is, that these are barbarians. I can give you example of Jagannath's Rath Yatra. The devotees, Jagannath Rath Yatra was dubbed as a Holocaust. This is rubbish. So without understanding the other culture, you try to project it as barbarian just to claim that you have the monopoly of civility and civilization. When I critique this enlightenment rationality, I understand that you need not be an atheist or agnostic to become human. So humanism doesn't really, you can be spiritual, you can be divine, and this to presume that believer is not rational, I think is a very fallacious understanding. Some believer may go beyond this understanding. They may commit mistake, as pointed out by Dr. Sharma. But this understanding, a believer is very well can be rational. Third, any humanism you construct, it should not be parochial in nature. Because radical hermeneutics can develop from this possibility, opening up cultures and the opening up dialogue across globe. In other words, this humanism must encourage Catholicity of visions. Unless this Catholicity comes, then you cannot really retain the core element of humanism. So Catholicism of vision should be the driving force of humanism of this integrated world. Well, the other thing is, like Taoism and Jainism, humanism should seek to promote peace, harmony with nature, and respect for all beings. Mahavir was a radical. He went much beyond. It's just not, even for the insect, even both the animate and inanimate world. And to blame West, see it as a culprit in every term. In the morning session, someone was pointing out, in fact, perhaps the minister was pointing out the documentation. That how documentation has been done by colonial administration. Okay, we have to critically examine it. But we also acknowledge that this documentation is very vital for our culture to protect and preserve our cultural traditions. So we can't really reject anything in toto. And to take humanism beyond the domain of the elites, the whole understanding of humanism that it is the monopoly of selective elites who can actually give you the discourse on humanism, not necessarily. In fact, you have to be cosmopolitan as well and also retain the elements of nativism, wisdom of native. Then I think you can construct a better human world and so on. Well, I think at the end I would say that we have to go beyond this idea of us and them thesis. We have to see the cosmos, as pointed out earlier, from Mahavir to Buddha to Aurobindo to Vivekananda. And Deen Dayal Upadhyay has very poignantly brought out this idea of integral humanism, but that has to be further researched because he wrote at a time in the 60s. I think we have come much beyond capitalism, and nature of capitalism has changed. The world has changed, Marxism has changed. So actually you have to look at the global dimension and do much more investigation and much more serious work on this. And finally, I think that the world would move on, and the essence of humanism is to understand human history, and it's a continuous process of self-understanding and self-realization. I think humanism has a much better potential to unite East and West. Thank you so much.
Thank the India Foundation and Sri Ravi Shankar's organization for organizing this wonderful meet, which gives an opportunity to churn so many ideas. But I think that the fundamental issue, which not only this conclave is facing, but also India is facing and the world is facing, is how to essentially adjust, if it can be, the present Western-inspired model for socio-economic and political organization, whether liberal or socio-democratic, to what we regard as traditional cultures. Because traditional cultures are so far only tolerated as aesthetic props, as long as they don't contradict the limits or restrict the scope of secular modernity. As mainstream economists like to say, there is no alternative, Tina, to the path blazed by the West. So under such guidelines, the ruling institutions of the world are heavily involved in social engineering without usually taking into account natural laws and psychological conditions in diverse cultures, as the main imperative is to raise the material productivity and increase the consumption patterns of individuals in the name of improving their well-being. And of course, nobody can argue with that. However, social engineering is found to upset and often destroy the natural balance of many systems, which, like all biological ones, are far from equilibrium. And here I want to emphasize a very important finding of modern science, which is that living systems being far from equilibrium are very fragile. They are nonlinear, which means that they are affected by unpredictable feedback loops and not reducible to mathematical logic. And all our economy is based on a form of mathematical logic or another, just as all our social, political, economic, cultural, educational institutions are based on a Baconian, Newtonian view of the world, which has long become outdated as of the emergence of quantum physics and the biology, the chemistry, the other sciences that came with it. So we are dealing with an essentially outdated scientific philosophy, which in turn reflects itself in an outdated and therefore inadequate political philosophy. And we see many examples of disrupted equilibriums, which are, for example, the dynamics between the sexes, which have sort of been so badly overturned that now there is a real crisis in many societies as to how people can actually live together in families, because people are becoming, in many cases, less and less suited to living in families. So that impacts family stability, the education and the moral and psychological well-being of the children, future generations, birth and death ratio. Societies are collapsing demographically because there is no renewal, sustainability of the ecosystem, and so on and so forth. And yet we keep saying that, well, because the West in its economic system has created a prosperity that was unseen, it must somehow be successful, and therefore there is no alternative but to follow it. However, I think the success of the West is essentially based on borrowing from the future. And what we see now is that we are beginning to pay the price. In fact, we have been paying the price for quite a while, but now the price is becoming simply beyond our means to afford, in the sense that our planet is collapsing and our species is simply grown beyond management, as we can see in the explosion of violence. And therefore, we have to see that somehow the mechanisms that were applied, even if they had some justification at some point, are no longer viable. The guiding principle should be instead, we cannot direct a living system, we can only disturb it. Therefore, social, political, and economic policies must be designed to orient a society towards a breakthrough and not let it break down. This is called eco-design. Development can only be sound if it is a form of learning, generating positive feedbacks in a qualitative sense, not only in a quantitative sense. The driver can only be an ethical source, but the ethics of modern civilization is anthropocentric, which means in Sanskrit ahamkar-based, and therefore inadequate. It should be biocentric, jiva-based, as the Jains would say, based on life as a whole, and holistic, akhanda, inseparable. So what we have to see now is that because of the prejudice that has come from the West, any society which doesn't conform to the Western ideals is seen necessarily as either an arrested society or a backward society. And of course, when you hear about the Hindu system talked about in the West, it's generally about polytheism and caste injustice. There is no question about polytheism. It's a completely irrelevant debate. I mean, if you analyze it carefully, there is no real difference between polytheism and monotheism, and there is no reason for Hinduism to try to be accepted as monotheistic, simply because it rises above that divergence, number one. Number two, the caste injustice system is there, but let's face it, it's also caused by a natural process of degeneration of social structures, which in turn are biologically based. And that's why all societies end up having their caste structures even when they claim not to have them. Very good example is the United States, which has developed a caste system, and I could go on that for quite a long time, even though it's supposed to be egalitarian. Why? Because an egalitarian society in the strict socio-economic term is simply unviable. I would like to say that what we are dealing with now is a corpus of knowledge, scientific knowledge, which is based on what we can call the systems view of life, title of a new book by Fritjof Capra and Pierluigi Luisi from Cambridge University Press. And that is what gives us a number of scientific laws that we can and should apply to our social, economic, and political system. I will only enumerate them: the property of contextuality, the property of emergence, the properties of recursion and consilience, the property of non-locality, cosmic proportions, and so on and so forth, which you might say all sound very theoretical. In what way does that impact our day-to-day life? Well, it does. Because if we create, or rather if we apply a new science, we also discover new sources of energy, which enable us to create power with non-polluting means, and which is also inexhaustible. And that is already being tested, and in some cases it is already being implemented, but it has to be made acceptable to the political economic system, which is not geared to receive it. And that's why the job of a country like India, not only for itself but for the world, is to devise its own system, not based on trying to catch up with the West, but rather on leapfrogging, quantum jump, which would integrate its traditional patterns of philosophical and spiritual management with the necessities of the day. And as we all know, when you reach a point of equilibrium, of homeostasis, obviously decay is inevitable, and the cyclical part of the cyclical aspect of life is what we cannot ever deny. I think the myth of limitless linear growth is simply untenable, and we have to rise above that in economic models. Thank you. I think I wanted to leave some time for questions.
Now, the question I'd like to pose, because I was a little bit puzzled by the very humane discussion about conversion, is that when, after Constantine, Charlemagne, Cortez, and Inquisition, did conversion cease to be an act of war? Can you please date the moment at which it ceased to be an act of war? Because conversion has always been an act of war, but perhaps I'm a bit confused, though I'm a historian too. When did this cease? Let me tell you, this war is being prosecuted with immense success in Nepal, a country which I know extremely well. A good 12-15% of Nepalese are already Christian. There are people from Germany, Norway, the United States, England, all over Nepal. And many Nepalese are saying in their censuses, we are Hindus. And they keep Hindu names. Nepal is on the way to becoming a Naga land. So we should stop pussyfooting. We should pass legislation and curtail this assault on the fundamentals of our civilization, which is why I so very much liked what Dr. Kashyap had to say and your brilliant summation. Sorry to be a bit difficult. Thank you.
My question is to Professor Arvind Sharma. You talked about the right to be converted, to convert and not to be converted. But what we are seeing in India for the last 15-20 years is that the poorest tribal groups in central India and Jharkhand, if you do a survey, then you'll find that overwhelming number of them have converted for reasons of poverty. And they don't understand this thing, that the right not to be converted. Also, if you look at the census figures, the number of people who are being listed as Hindus, I think you'll see that there's a declining number. And what is happening in India today is that there seems to be a consensus among the politicians and the intelligentsia that the Hindus do not have the right to convert, but they are willing to give that right of conversion to Islam and Christianity. So the very sophisticated way in which you presented the problem I mean, does it actually apply to the ground situation in India?
Now, the question about racism and Hinduism being identified. Well, I think the riposte to that is identify Christianity with imperialism and legislate accordingly. I mean, these are very simple ways of dealing with this. But that is only possible if we study comparative religion. And we don't do that in our country. We hardly have any departments for the study of world religions. Regarding conversion and law, yeah, I think this, I mentioned the ambiguity about conversion. I think this really has to be clarified, that these are two different rights, allied but different. My right to change my religion, I think hardly anybody would object that one should have this freedom. We should be able to choose our own religion. But somebody else's right to ask me to change my religion, especially if there's a power imbalance involved in the two parties, if there is clear inducement or intimidation. I mean, it sounds very strange to me that the human rights discourse does not recognize the fact that if you think that somebody who is not belonging to a particular religion will go to hell, is a very serious way of compromising the person's dignity, on which the entire human rights discourse is supposed to be based. If I think that somebody who does not belong to my religion will go to hell, I am seriously compromising the dignity of the other person. But the discussion hasn't proceeded along these lines for some reason. But we do need a very clear recognition of the distinction of these two rights. I think our government has a golden opportunity at the moment, because of the debate on conversion, to seize the initiative in this matter. The third point I have here is about, yes, Christian proselytization under the cover of secularism. We should recognize that the idea of the secular is also a Christian idea. Then the whole idea becomes easier to comprehend. I remember a statement being made a few days ago by the British ambassador to Nepal, in which he said that he hopes that the right to the freedom to change one's religion will be a part of the Nepalese constitution which is being drafted. Now, I doubt very much if the British ambassador wanted to change his own religion. Right? So what he was really asking for, the right for the missionaries to change the religion of the Nepalese. But it wasn't in secular camouflage. The point was made under cover of secularism. The very important points raised by Sandhya Jain regarding tribals, and they think that material gain is a perfectly valid reason for converting. We have just had a big debate on that. If it is so, that all these Hindu organizations should be allowed to go forth with their work. This is a very important point. Mahatma Gandhi has a lot to say on this. That what should be the ground for conversion? Mahatma Gandhi did not acknowledge any material basis as valid for conversion. And if you really believe in secularism, then if the tribals are poor, that's a secular problem. We should have a secular solution. Why should religion be an element in that? And on the question of the Hinduism at the mercy of other, what some people call predatory religions. It's a very strong word, so I hesitate to use it. But sometimes in this discourse, the proselytizing religions are also described as predatory religions, which gives us a good idea of how the non-missionary religions tend to view their activity. If the Dalits, the backward castes, and other backward castes and all, which constitute a majority of the population of India, can have government protection, then let us consider the following argument. the situation regarding the confrontation between missionary and non-missionary religions is like a heavyweight boxer fighting a lightweight boxer. That is, the missionary religions over centuries have perfected the techniques of converting others, against which the non-missionary religions virtually have no defense, because they don't think like that. This is most obvious in the case of primal religions. So if, from this point of view, the Hindus constitute the weaker section of the population, should not the government come to their help? When the predatory religions are exercising their rights to proselytize. So fairness demands that by the same logic by which a majority of the population, because it is a weaker section, can be given government protection, all the Hindus are the weaker section in this case against the wiles of the predatory religions. Well, I know it's a very radical idea, but one has to begin somewhere. Thank you.
I hate to join issues with my very good friend, Professor Sharma. I think it is not correct to say that the right to change religion is absolute and that nobody can disagree with everybody's right to change his religion. To give an example, a Hindu under the law can have only one wife, and a Muslim under the law can have 4 wives. Now there have been any number of cases where persons Hindus change their religion to give up their first wife and to marry another woman. There is the latest position under the law is, Supreme Court has also ruled that such conversion will be illegal. If you change your religion merely for the sake of remarriage, then that conversion will be illegal. Second, Professor Sharma said that secularism is a Christian idea. My dear friends, I submit that secularism, as we understand it and properly understood, genuine secularism is very much a Vedic idea. Ekam sad vipara bahudha vadanti. Truth is one, the learned speak it in different ways. In the Gita, it is categorically said, Lord Krishna says, that in whatever form you worship me, in whatever form you worship me, your prayers will reach me. So different forms of worship, different kinds of relationship between the individual and the divine have been accepted from ancient times in India, and the whole essence of the Vedantic philosophy is that you see in the other yourself. And as was very rightly pointed out by the earlier speaker, that when somebody is killed, it is not only the one who is killed, but the one who is killing. Both die. That is the message of the Gita also. It's the killer should not think that he is killing. And in fact, I am reminded of Eugene O'Neill, where the soldier says that every night after killing someone, I feel I am killing myself. I am killing myself. So, if you see yourself in the other, Walt Whitman said, I do not ask the wounded man how he feels. I myself become the wounded man. So if you see yourself in the other, and that is His Holiness Dalai Lama's concept of compassion, or what you might call karuna, or compassion. You see yourself in the other man and see the other in yourself. What better secularism or Sarvadham Sambhav can you have? If everyone is divine, Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, or Analhak, I am God, but you are also God. If we see the divine in the other man, how can we say secularism is not an Indian idea? Of course, dictionary meaning of secularism, anti-religion and all that is different. Thank you.
Well, Kashyap ji has done me the honor of criticizing me, so I might want to say something in response. I entirely agree with the idea that when we say that everybody should be free to choose their own religion, we presume in the Gandhian sense that the choice is being made for spiritual reasons. An Indian thinker has made a distinction between what he calls horizontal conversion and vertical conversion. So if you think of a mountain as representing our progress towards the divine, as a mist-shrouded mountain because we do not know what the real divine is, but we are marching towards it. So we are going up this mountain, and if we just change our religions and not our life, then it is horizontal conversion. You are going around the mountain rather than up the mountain. Vertical conversion is leading a superior moral and spiritual life. The only exception Gandhi made and allowed for conversion was when somebody felt that the person's vertical conversion was entirely dependent on the person's horizontal conversion. Otherwise, he was totally opposed to conversion. Okay, so that's the response to the first one. Second one, sir, I would submit, we are trying to force the meaning of the word pluralism into secularism. Both secularism and pluralism have something in common. They both want to prevent the domination of the public square by the religion or belief system of the majority, both pluralism and secularism. But what they intend to replace that dominance with is where they differ. So pluralism allows for principled distancing from all religions, but engaging them, or what we call multiculturalism in some contexts. Whereas secularism of the severe variety would replace it with science and reason. This point is very important for us because both pluralism, especially Indian type of pluralism, and secularism want a secular state, but for opposite reasons. The secularism wants a secular state because no religion is true. Pluralism wants a secular state because all religions are true. So I think we should not overlook this different logics. The final point has to do with the Tibet and the response of Tibet to Chinese aggression was mentioned earlier. A particular Lama was released by the Chinese who had been in detention for a very long time in Tibet. When he met the Dalai Lama asked him whether he ever felt that his life was in danger. Please mark this conversation. The Dalai Lama asked the other Lama, now in India, whether he ever felt that his life was in danger when he was being tortured by the Chinese and so on. And he said, yes, once or twice. And when was that? The Dalai Lama asked. And he said, once or twice I really thought I might hate the Chinese.
When the East meets the West, we saw in the morning Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard reciting the Bhagavad Gita, whereas most of our MPs probably do not even know what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. When the East meets West, people in the West are practicing yoga, while people in India are practicing Zumba to get fit. So what can we do as a society to bring back our culture first to us? In our country, at least till the last political dispensation, we were told to be apologetic of being proud of our religion, whereas the West, they are very proud of their religion. What can we as a society do, or what can we as a race do to make sure that we bring back our culture first to our people?
I would like to say in one sentence that the technology, the contributions of the West are already here. They have been in some way accepted, and there is no going back on that. However, there is an opportunity to create a new wave, a new generation of technology based on the traditional knowledge. And that's what I hope this government will support. Now, the organizer of our session is from Goa, and he has asked to give a very brief comment in closing the session on the situation in Goa, where he comes from. So.
Thank you very much. Since this topic was on conversions and about these issues, and since I really am from Goa, I thought let me provide some information that might be helpful to the audience here. We've been under Portuguese colonization for 450 years. And unlike many other parts of the world which saw Portuguese colonization, where the local culture was totally purged beyond extinction, I think we in Goa have been a very resilient lot and very proud of the fact that despite of 450 years, we still were able to retain our own Hindu identity at various costs. Goa still today is 65-67% Hindu and 30% Catholic. I want to raise another issue between the Catholicism and the way the Catholics see themselves in Goa and Christians around the country as well. When I was doing my PhD in the US and I was on a Fulbright fellowship, I had a fellow roommate of mine who was an Indian Christian from Madras. We were having dinner one day in America, in Washington, D.C., and a couple of Americans came forward and asked him his name. So he said, I'm Dr. Anthony Raj. So they obviously said, oh, you are a Christian, right? You are a Roman Catholic. The obvious thing was, oh, you're a Roman Catholic Christian. And his immediate impromptu answer was, I'm sorry, I'm an Indian Christian. Now, when I probed him further, I said, well, why did you have to make that clarification? Normally people would not. I mean, they say, fine, okay, we follow Roman Catholicism. He said, look, I am a Christian. For whatever reason, I am a Christian. But I do follow my Hindu values and Hindu roots. So he sees himself as a Hindu who predates his own Christian identity. He said, I don't need to be called a Roman Catholic in order to prove my commitment to a cause that probably is fundamental to me today. Why I say that here? Because in Goa particularly, when it comes to, for example, the Konkani language, which is our mother tongue, and when the issue gets raised up, there is a tremendous amount of resentment of following Konkani in what is called as a Devanagari script. In fact, a lot of prominent Christian circles here often argue that we don't want to follow Konkani in the Devanagari script because that makes us seem to follow Hinduism. We want it in the Roman Lipi. So everything that is Catholic is seen to be kind of borrowed or alien from the outside. And I say this because since secularism topic was raised, I think what we have really come about is a distorted and pervert view of secularism, where we have to negate Hinduism to prove your secular credentials. Whereas the definition of secularism was the state would not patronize any religion. I think that is something that remains very fundamental to our discourse. I'll be happy to speak to you all informally on anything that you would need in Goa. With this, let me thank the moderator and the panelists for having a very insightful and incisive session.